So I thought I'd start out with the invasion curve and where these plants that I'm talking about are on the invasion curve. So for each species in a water body, they fall along this invasion curve here. So for example, in the Mohawk River, water chestnut would be way up here where it's very common and you could only exclude it or suppress it. You couldn't get rid of it. And then maybe hydrilla would be somewhere down here where you could still contain it or even eradicate it. And so the ones I'm going to talk about are statewide emerging species. They're not very common in the state or just entering the state or just outside the state down here on that part of the curve. And as they become more common, they also become more expensive to control. So here's another part of that invasion curve is the lag phase. And the lag phase is the delay of when something is introduced and then it reaches a critical mass somehow through some biological process or genetics or some other process, and then it starts to become a lot more common. And it goes up into the higher part of that curve. And the lag phase, it's hard to predict, but by the time we recognize that something's out of a lag phase and it's problematic, it's probably been around for a while. So this is the most difficult part of this process. By the time we recognize and detect something, it may be too late. And so it's really hard to get enough people out in the field, enough experts, enough ground covered to try and detect these low abundance or emerging species before they become a problem. And people aren't really interested in them or they don't know about them because they're not around. They're only maybe in a few places and people don't know about them. So that's why I try and give these talks to get people more information about them. And one day you may be out there and you spot one of these things. And then that's happened before too. So I'll go through the list here. First one is water hyacinth, and a problem here. This is, I missed an H here, E-I-C-H-H-O-R-N, two H's. But this one is in the subtropics, tropics, and it's been found in New York in a few places. This actually is a picture from a pond in the Catskills last summer, and it has not been found to overwinter yet in New York. So we've mapped it, but what's good about IMAP is we can go back to those places and look at it again and see if it's overwintering in those certain ponds. So far it hasn't. It's in the same family as pickerel weed, and it has those sort of heart-shaped leaves there and it's a floating plant, which is one of the world's worst invaders. And I'll show you some of the maps that go along with these species. Here you can see, this is from the BONAP, is Biota of North America project. This is a great site to see how things are distributed around the United States. So by county. You can see it's common in the south. These red ones means it's a noxious weed. And then there's some counties up here which they've documented water hyacinth, but still not overwintering. So somebody took a specimen, put it in a herbarium, and then it gets on the map. But we're still not sure that it's overwintering. But with winters like this one we've had, probably could expect it to start doing that. Okay, the next one is water wheel, Aldrovanda vesiculosa. Talked that it wasn't in New York yet. Well, it is. And this is a pond in Orange County in the Catskills. It looks very Adirondack-y. And it has Aldrovanda, nice name, called the water wheel. And it's in the Droseraceae, the same family as can't think of the Venus flytrap. And so this is kind of like an underwater Venus flytrap. It doesn't, you're familiar with our bladderworts that have the little pods that suck in insects. Well, this has sort of a clasping mechanism, just like a Venus flytrap that clasps the insects as they trigger it. And it has these whorls of leaves, grows really fast, can cover a large amount of water. And it's in a place called Big Pond in the Catskills, southern Catskills in Orange County. And it was introduced there by a carnivorous plant enthusiast who, because this is globally rare, they wanted to sort of spread it around and make sure that it's surviving. Now, we don't know what it's going to do with the bladderworts, how it's going to outcompete the bladderworts, or what it's going to do with the insect life, because this can get pretty big insects in it. So this is a real worry. And there's a whole book on it, Aldrovanda, the water wheel plant, you can get on the internet. And each one of these plants, if you take down the scientific name, go on Google and Google the scientific name, and there's lots of information about each one of these plants. Here's the distribution in the US right now. Virginia, New Jersey, it doesn't have New York in there yet. But the Virginia plants, recent contact with them, they said that the original introduction, they found it spreading away from the original introduction in Virginia. So we know that birds or something is spreading it around. Next one, Myriophyllum aquaticum. You know the Myriophyllums. And this one, parrot feather, is on Long Island and a few places, and one in Dutchess County. And it looks like a Myriophyllum, but it's that sort of chartreuse color, light green color, and the leaves are pretty stiff. It almost looks like a plastic plant. And here it is down here, covering the water surface down there on the shoreline. So it emerges, and you can see that nice green chartreuse color covering the shorelines. So, yeah, it does flower. But it again, rapid growth. A lot of these things are symptoms of what? Too much fertilizer, too much nitrogen, too much phosphorus in these ponds, and so they really take off, and they just cover the water surface. Well, they have similar habits. Here's the distribution of that one. You can see common in the southeast, and then up into a few places. Here's Long Island, a few places in New England too. Not up in upstate New York yet. Pistia, water lettuce. That one, in this book, Biology and Control of Aquatic Plants, is a really good chapter on Pistia and also water hyacinth. We have found this, just like water hyacinth, we have found it not, that it's in some ponds, this one's in western New York, that it's introduced by water gardeners, but doesn't overwinter yet. But we expect that with warmer winters eventually that it would overwinter. So keep your eyes out for this one. Again, that sort of chartreuse color. These leaves looks like lettuce, and it has a velvety feel to it. And eventually it would cover the whole surface of that pond. Along with water hyacinth, one of the world's worst invasive aquatic plants. It's very common in the tropics and subtropics. I think originally from Brazil, maybe.
Steve, a question, when you say it doesn't overwater, does it mean it's dead and it's not going to come back next year?
Right.
Okay.
Doesn't it gets frozen.
So that's basically one season's growth then. It's
Yeah, right. And what we expect is that these things will start to overwinter in areas that have warm water outflows, maybe like nuclear plant places or springs that have a constant temperature all year round. And they'll be able to overwinter starting in those places. Here's the map for Pistia. You can see down in Florida it's most common. And there's some debate whether it's actually native to the US. It was found originally in 1765 in Florida. And, but things were being introduced by ships by that time too. So it may be native, but it's spreading north. I think it's overwinters as far as maybe North Carolina. Okay, our next one is Calitrichia stagnalis. This is pond water starwort. We have 5 water starwort species in New York. 4 of them are native, and this one, stagnalis, is not native, from Europe. And it's again a Long Island, a little bit in the lower Hudson area, and here's one of our native species here with the narrow leaves, and this one has more spoon-shaped leaves and that rosette of leaves at the top. One of the main distinguishing features is sort of the roundish fruit too, but it doesn't fruit till later in the season, so sometimes you can't see that. So this is what it looks like as it grows, and so our native Calitrichias can do this too, but we're not sure how this exotic one is going to outcompete the native ones in the long run too. Okay, you all know your duckweeds. You know what duckweeds look like, right? And so we often have 4 genera of duckweeds in New York. Lemna minor, Spirodella, Landoltia, and Wolfia. We don't have Wolfiella in New York. But the largest duckweeds are the Spirodellas, and they're floating, and they have, well, here it says 7 to 12 roots coming out of the bottom. And then the Wolfias are the really tiny, tiny watermeal ones. And oftentimes when you see duckweeds in a pond, you see more than one species. You'll see the Wolfias and the Spirodellas and the Lemnas at the same time. But when you go see duckweeds, just stick your hand in there and see if you can see the different species. This one is Landoltia punctata, and it used to be in Spirodella, but now it's Landoltia because it has up to, well, usually fewer roots, 2 to 3 roots. It's about 1/3 of the size of a Spirodella, the dotted duckweed, and it's often red on the bottom like that. So that's what it looks like on somebody's hand. So on a boat, if you swipe off some duckweeds on a boat and you see small ones like that with roots hanging off of it, you look at the number of roots, and if there's just a few roots, then it could be that. They found that this one is becoming herbicide resistant more than the other duckweeds. So this exotic one might be a problem.
I have a question.
Yep.
Is there a starry duckweed? Or is this one I'm thinking of?
Yeah, the Wolfiellas may have that name. They have more of a really narrow star-looking leaf. Yeah.
And what about the one that looks like a fern? It's red.
Yeah, I have that one up here.
Okay, good.
Yep. So here's the distribution of Landoltia in the southeast out into the west coast, and just coming up, there it is in northern Pennsylvania. But this one doesn't overwinter as easily as the other duckweeds. It doesn't have turions like most of the duckweeds do. So it may not get up here as fast as we think it will. But again, maybe start to overwinter in some of these warmer water areas. Water soldiers, has anybody heard of water soldiers? Yeah, a few people. And so this is a plant that is from northern Europe, Asia area, and it looks like aloe, so or the top of a pineapple, some people say. And the genus Stratoides means soldiers, and aloides means like aloe. So it's only in North America in the Trent River in Ontario, which is directly north of Rochester across the lake. And it covers some acres there, so they're really battling this one. It's in the same family, the Hydrocaritaceae, as Hydrilla, Elodea. And this shows the flower, but they haven't seen the flower in Ontario yet.
It's not succulent-like though, right? The leaves aren't like an aloe.
Yeah, they are kind of.
Oh, they are?
Yeah, and they're saw teeth too. So
Yeah.
that's the only thing that you would see like that with saw teeth on them in the water. Here's what it looks like as a group. So this comes up and the leaves emerge from the water, and then later in the season they get waterlogged and they float back down. They sort of sink back down under the water. So you can actually see a whole stand like this under the water later in the season. And this is a water gardening plant. Probably somebody dumped it here in Ontario, and I could see where somebody would say that's pretty and take it somewhere else. So here's a plant that's native to the United States, but it's not to the northeast. And Ludwigia peploides, floating water primrose, is only in the Peconic River on Long Island and another place, Brooklyn Botanic Garden and one other place upstate. So this is what it looks like in California as it takes over a water body. You can just fill everything up. It's beautiful, pretty. One of these are. But they've been battling it on the Peconic for many years now, probably 10 years or more, and really having a hard time getting rid of it. It's rhizomatous and overwinters in the primrose family. Here's its distribution. You see those light green, sort of the neon green counties are where it's native, and then the other lighter green to the northeast is where it's adventive and has spread since then. This one's a real problem. You don't want this in your lake. And here's the azolla. So this is the one you were talking about, Eastern mosquito fern. I included this one. It's not non-native. It's native to New York, actually. But we get calls about this one because all of a sudden the whole lake will fill up with this in a season. And it's red. In the sun it turns red. So it is a fern, has spores. And this is a picture from Prospect Park in Brooklyn. So one year, all of a sudden, all their ponds were filled up with azolla. And they figured that it was because New York City I'm not sure why they did it, but they put phosphorus in their water. And
That's corrosive.
corrosive thing, you're right, exactly. And so
It's like the plant,
they're,
Point Michigan.
yeah,
They use the orthophosphate along the pipes.
yeah, exactly. And so the ponds became a lot more fertile for that.
Now they just have harmful algal locations.
Yeah. Well, this will take over an algal bloom. This will keep an algal bloom out. It's pretty too, actually. And there's where it is native. So it's spread around. You can see in New York, up around the Great Lakes and down Lower Hudson.
Well, thanks. So now we're going to jump over to the animal side. So I'm also with the New York Natural Heritage Program and with the Invasive Species Database for the state. I'm Jennifer Dean. And I'm not an aquatic zoologist, just to give you that up front, but I'm an entomologist by training. Fortunately, there's no invasive insects that are in water systems that we know of, so that's not my expertise. But I do have a cheat sheet, so you might see me refer to that every once in a while. But I conferred with some experts from the DEC Fisheries Department on what species they think would be good to cover in terms of emerging either in the state so far, or not in the state so far, or in low populations that they definitely want people to be aware of. And also some colleagues from the USGS Non-Indigenous Aquatic Species Database. They have some aquatic zoologist experts there, and they gave me a couple of species that I hadn't heard of before to also include in this. And so, we know that there's a lot of aquatic animal invasives in the state, and this is a snapshot of the data that we have in IMAP invasives for the state invasive species database of all aquatic animals. So you can filter out by these different taxonomic types, or I guess functional groups, I should say. So this is all the aquatic animal observations within the database. A lot of our common villains, the zebra mussel, Asian clam, a lot of those that you'll see quite a bit. But thinking about things that we don't have here, fortunately, and hopefully we won't have here, I don't know, probably a lot of you have seen these infamous photos of the Asian carp and the Mississippi River drainage. And, you know, they have gone viral on YouTube in terms of these videos of fish coming out as a boat goes through and hitting people on the side of the head and in the boat. And, you know, just the enormous amount of fish in the river is quite scary in itself. And so we all know that Asian carp is one of these biggies that we're watching out for. There's a lot of political discussions about, you know, barriers between the Mississippi River drainage and the Great Lakes drainages. But if they do get into the Great Lakes, which they may or may not be already, then we need to be very conscientious of these fish in New York State and the lakes here. And this was helpful for me. There's a website called asiancarp.org that is just a great resource for a lot of information on Asian carp. And just getting the term straight, because Asian carp is kind of this bucket of species that people have been using this term collectively for carp that are from Asia, that are introduced. And so I just wanted to clarify the different species that we're talking about when we refer to this. So there's 4 species that are commonly thrown into this bucket of invasive Asian carp: the bighead carp, the silver carp, black carp, and the grass carp. And I'm mainly going to focus on the bighead and the silver carp. The black carp are just known from some smaller isolated pockets in the Mississippi River drainage. The grass carp there's actually a sterile variety of the grass carp. It's a triploid, I guess a hybrid. And so these are actually introduced quite often for vegetation control, aquatic vegetation control, the triploid sterile grass carp. But there have been sightings, even actually earlier this spring along the Hudson River, of the diploid grass carp that could potentially be reproducing. So, but it's you can't tell with the naked eye if it's the sterile or the reproducing one. So I'm not going to go into great detail, but you know, it's also something to keep in mind. And there are 3 additional carps that are native to Asia that have been introduced to the U.S., but they're not usually included in that bucket term, Asian carp. But that includes the common carp, which is typically stocked, goldfish, which can be considered an invasive species as well, and the Crucian carp. And so just focusing on the bighead carp first, this can be a very large, long, narrow fish. It can get up to 100 pounds and 4 feet long, so these can really get some heft onto them. Some of the characteristics, you'll see this also for the silver carp, is that the eyes are lower below the midline of the body, and they're also protruding downwards, pointing downwards more. We have the bighead carp essentially don't have a stomach to hold the food, so they're constantly consuming. And they're eating vegetation, plankton, so they're out competing a lot of the native fish for a lot of this vegetation. And this combined with the silver carp can make up 95% of the biomass in some sections of rivers and the areas where they're heavily invaded. So it can really get to, they're just consuming constantly and outcompeting a lot of the native fish there. And this, along with the silver carp, were introduced as filter feeders, vegetation feeders, to help keep like all aquaculture centers clean that are raising fish for consumption. Some of the other characteristics, there's no scales on the head itself, and then the low set eyes that are kind of pointing downwards. And I guess on the common carp, I have a little inset there. The common carp has these little barbels that come down from its like little handlebar mustache almost. That is absent in the bighead carp. And then the silver carp, it's very similar, but does not have those dark splotches that the bighead carp has. It's also, present in the Mississippi River drainage. It has not, physical specimens have not been confirmed in the Great Lakes, but the environmental DNA, the eDNA testing has come up positive for areas in the Great Lakes from the waters. So there could be carp present there that we just have not physically seen yet. Oh, and before I forget, these maps are from the USGS Non-Indigenous Aquatic Species Database. They have an excellent resource on species distribution maps for aquatic animals and plants. And one thing that's nice is that they'll, if it is native to one part of the United States, they'll distinguish that, with different coloration on the map, so you can see where the native watersheds are versus the invasive watersheds. They're typically a little bit smaller, but they can also get, to these larger sizes. They're typically like 40 to 60 pounds at their maximum, where the big head gets upwards of 100 pounds. And then some of the characteristics, once again, no scales on the head. It's more of this silver color, but no barbels or and it has the downward slanting eyes as well, which distinguishes it from that common carp that you might see more often. But of course, if you have a bait bucket full of small fish, it might be really hard to tell the juvenile fish from from other native fishes that are in the bait bucket. I mean, you can compare it here to gizzard shad, which is commonly used in bait. So it would be very difficult to tell. That eye situated below the midline of the body is a characteristic that's very helpful. If you see something that looks out of place, I mean, that's one of the best indicators. Go ahead and snap a photo and send it to someone for confirmation, or take the specimen as well. All right, so another fish that actually is in New York now, but it's something we want to keep track of as it gets into new water bodies, is the round goby. And this is a much smaller fish. It's just getting 4 to 6 inches in length. So it's of course not that huge size that the carp are getting up to. Some ways to identify these species: they have they look very similar to the native sculpins, but if you look at the underside of the body, there's one pelvic fin, one that's kind of like a scallop-shaped fin, and on the native species, it'll be 2 separate fins that are coming out from the bottom of. The older fish do have a black and brown splotching. They have a black spot on one of their dorsal fins, and kind of a froggy-looking face. They have these frog-like eyes, thick lips. I can go back to that photo so you can get the more colorful look. And so these guys can, excuse me, displace native fishes by outcompeting for spawning sites, and also by directly consuming the eggs and larvae of native fish and stocked fish as well. There's been a lot of studies on the consumption of smallmouth bass fish by the round gobies, and actually in Ohio and Lake Erie they had to shorten the fishing season for that species because of the round goby consumption. So, and one of those flip sides with invasive species, even though they are displacing a lot of native fish, apparently they consume a lot of zebra mussels. So there could be one benefit. And there's also an endangered species from Lake Erie, the Lake Erie water snake, that has now made round goby pretty much the principal component of its diet, and it has rebounded in its population and has actually been removed from the endangered species list since the round goby have appeared. But there's a trade-off there.
What'd you call it? What snake?
Oh, the Lake Erie water snake. But they also are a carrier of avian botulism, and so the round goby has been linked to loon die-offs in the Great Lakes as well. And another fish to look out for is the northern snakehead fish. This is a top predator, so it can consume a lot of other fish within the lake. It can actually consume fish that are about a third of its body length, so it's really going after them. It's an obligate air breather, which makes it quite an interesting fish, and it can live out of water for up to 4 days. And actually, the young of this fish can migrate across land to get from one water body to another. So this fish is found down in Long Island, a few Long Island ponds, and it was found in a water body down in Orange County. And this is one of those stories that they think that they have successfully eradicated it from that water body in Orange County. DEC had a huge effort where they were able to get rid of that fish, and so far follow-up monitoring has not shown any more snakehead. This is a species that's really valuable to the Asian cuisine, so it does get intentionally transported and stocked into water bodies sometimes. So that's one of the major pathways for spreading this species. It does prefer like stagnant water. Oh, okay. 2 minutes. All right. I should move faster. All right. And we'll look at some of the characteristics. I think mainly like I guess the face has kind of an elongated nose in a sense, but these fins, both the top and the bottom fins, extend to the back of the body. And that is distinguished from the native bow fins that are very similar because they have 2 distinct fins on the bottom. All right, moving on to something much, much smaller, the spiny and fishhook water fleas. And these are something that are present in New York State as well. There's something that, once it gets into a water body, then we don't know any ways to get rid of it. It is going to spread. They're predaceous crustaceans, and they compete with native fish as well, and they can foul up fishing gear. So a lot of times anglers are the first ones to spot these guys because this is what it'll look like if it gets on your fishing line. It's kind of like these clumps of wet cotton. They'll aggregate onto the fishing line, and so you won't be able to reel it back in. So it's important lesson to check all your gear as well. And then another species to be on the lookout for is the New Zealand mudsnail. And this is very, very tiny, 4 to 6 millimeters, but they are very prolific. They can get up to 300,000 individuals per square meter. So a lot of individuals. The ecological impacts are actually unknown. There hasn't been that much studying of them. But with the sheer amount of size, and they are detritus and vegetation feeders, they can really change the net primary productivity of a lake or a water body. And so it's one of those, if you spot it, it'd probably be better to act quickly rather than find out what the potential impacts would be. But it does have a right-hand coil on the shell and some deep grooves on it. And this is one that was definitely not on my radar, but this is one that one of the USGS NAS scientists recommended. It's only known to reproduce in the south so far. This is the Cuban treefrog, and it's a major consumer of native tree frogs, and so it has a big ecological impact. But it has been popping up along in various spots because it's being transported on horticultural plants. And so if you get some nice tropical plants for an indoor display or outdoor display, they could be hidden in there and then hop off. These guys are much bigger than any of the other native tree frogs we might have. They can get up to 6 inches long. And as climate is changing and areas are getting warmer, winters are getting milder, it's possible that they can start reproducing further up the coast. But the adults are warty. They look almost more like a toad. But the juveniles do have smoother skin, so they're harder to tell from the natives. But the Cuban tree frogs have these bigger toe pads proportionally compared to the rest of their toes. And another one this is one that is in New York, the rusty crayfish. But you do want to keep an eye out for it. It is a very quickly reproducing crayfish, and it can get up to many individuals per square meter. I think 20 individuals per square meter. And the most remarkable thing is how quickly they can take out the vegetation within a water body. They're in creeks and lakes, and they can remove up to 90% of the vegetation in a very short amount of time. One thing that's very distinctive of them, it's harder to tell in this photo, but they have a rusty spot where they get their name on both sides of their carapace, so it almost looks like you dipped your fingers in red paint and then tried to grab the back of the crayfish. And it has these little black bands at the claw tip. So those are very distinctive. And if you do find them, then the other alternative is then to have a crayfish boil. This is from Minnesota, where they have a huge problem with the rusty crayfish. I found this really fascinating. Probably many of you have seen the presentations that Dave McNeil from Sea Grant has given about his work with University of Buffalo professors that did a risk analysis of European fishes that are not here yet that have the potential for invading and doing well in our climate of lakes. And so they have a whole list of species ranked by how well they could potentially do in this area if they were to arrive from the Ponto-Caspian area in Europe. And so it's, just points out that there's so many animals that we don't know about yet that, they're not on our radar, but they could be. And I'd be remiss if I didn't put a plug in for, if you do see some new, or you have new sightings of aquatic invaders in your area, we encourage you to report it to the New York State database. The nyimapinvasives.org has links for requesting a login or just reporting it if you just want to report something straight away. But there is a smartphone app as well, so you can, if you have a smartphone, you can take a picture and then upload it directly using the GPS coordinates on your phone. And that way we can get, that as reports come in, those observations get sent out to the state experts for confirmation. So like if you enter something of hydrilla, then it gets sent to Scott Kishbaugh. So there's a lot of people who are checking the photographs that get entered into this on a regular basis.